When I returned home to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, it was a city in shock. It had suffered yet another disaster. Fires, floods, hurricanes, starvation, revolution, rebellion. All of these things had happened, man-made and natural disasters. Each generation had to find an appropriate response for it. Ever since that very first failure, that failure of tobacco in 1718, and that second horrible crisis of slavery. But perhaps the worst crisis was after slavery, the disappointment that for another 70 years, racial discrimination would continue here in New Orleans. Marie Laveau, the great voodoo priestess. She was someone who saw Andrew Jackson ride in town when she was a teenager. She was born a free woman of color, but her grandmother was a slave. She was someone who would have probably known who Jean Lafitte was. She lived through this period. She lived through the Civil War. By that time, she was in her 60s. And then she would live through that horrible period of post-Reconstruction segregation, and she would lead her people into a new era. She would show oppressed people how to find resilience. It's so ironic in many ways that the most famous woman in New Orleans history during that period of terrible racial discrimination would be a woman of African descent, a woman of tremendous power. She used that power to help her people and to show people the way through a terrible, dark period. There are a lot of misconceptions about Vodou. What do you think the greatest misconception is?
Well, first of all, people have Vodou, the religion, completely confused with voodoo, the spellcraft. It's really interesting that the whole practice of Vodou people have tried to suppress it. And the more we try to suppress it, the more the brand of Vodou sort of rises in New Orleans. That's what we're known for, and it kept the whole idea of voodoo alive in people's minds. And I think that in New Orleans, it's so embedded in our culture.
Not long after Marie Laveau died, Homer Plessy, who grew up in this neighborhood near St. Roch Market, would sit on a train car not a mile from here to challenge the segregation law. He looked as white as I am, but he had a drop of black blood. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court, Plessy versus Ferguson, one of the great cases in legal history, but it affirmed segregation. However, the civil rights movement began with him right here in New Orleans. A generation later, Louis Armstrong is born to a black prostitute who works the brothels of Storyville, abandoned by his father. The Karnofsky family tailors take him in, and they speak Yiddish to their children and sing to them at night. And Armstrong interprets this, because he can't speak Yiddish, to what will become scat. So the scat that you hear from Louis Armstrong comes from that Yiddish tailor here in New Orleans, Yiddish, with this great jazz musician, perhaps the greatest jazz musician of all time, perhaps one of the greatest entertainers of all times. He crossed racial barriers, and yet he did speak out one time. It took one time. He said, "Mr. President, you're a coward if you don't send troops to Arkansas." The president sent troops to Arkansas. Now, you knew Louis Armstrong.
I do Louis Armstrong.
And he came in here a few times to talk to you.
Louis was tough. Yep, he was king of Zulus, and my husband was toasting Louis Armstrong.
Here you are, a person who's met 4 presidents, 5?
Isn't that unbelievable? I remember standing on the corner when I was going to St. Mary's Academy in 1936, along there, waiting to see President Roosevelt. Now, to me, that was as close as I was going to get to the President of these United States,
Yes.
was to look at him go by in a car.
Now they come to your kitchen.
Now they come to me. I'm just a cook, I know that, but everybody got to eat. So I tell my children, if you're in this business, it's a good business. I don't care how the world turns, somebody has to eat, and you can feed them. And feed
all
them
the world's problems can be solved around
a plate of food. a good gumbo and some fried chicken, and you got it made. You got it made. So you take that and you live like that day-to-day, man, and you look at the bright side of life.
We end where we began. The best way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Think Sally Ann Glassman. If the women are taking care of the food, they're pretty much in charge of your health. Think about love and oysters and the aromas and spices that seduce us here. Think family and the tradition of not leaving the table until all of the conversation is done. It is the joie de vivre, the joy of life, of the French and the Senegambians, the native population that was here, the prudish Americans even, the charlatan pirates. All of them still live today within us, within this culture, today in New Orleans. It is a layered culture and one I am so proud to be a part of.